The clerk had already called the case. The tow order was on the desk. The license suspension notice was clipped to the front of the file. And Miguel Alvarez, 32 years old, work boots still dusted white from drywall, was seconds away from hearing the words that would take away his job, his truck, and probably the apartment he shared with his son. Then the little boy slipped out of his grandmother's hand, walked straight past the rail, and stared up at Judge Caprio. "I need to sit up there," he said, pointing at the bench, "because you're deciding if my dad can come home." Nobody laughed. Not the clerk. Not the parking enforcement officer. Not the woman from collections who had spent the morning calling out unpaid balances like she was reading meter numbers. The room just went still. Outside, rain smeared across the courthouse windows in Providence. Inside, the judge looked down at a 5-year-old in a red puffer jacket, one sneaker untied, cheeks still wet from crying, and a father who suddenly looked more terrified of his son speaking than of any fine on the table. That was the moment this stopped being a routine traffic case. Because on paper, it was simple. Miguel Alvarez had 6 camera citations, 2 failure to appear notices, a suspended registration, and a court balance that had ballooned from $480 into $216 once penalties, reinstatement fees, and collection charges got done with it. The city's position was even simpler. He had ignored the notices, he kept driving, he had to pay or lose everything. But what looked like another man with excuses was about to become something far more dangerous for the people who built their money on nobody asking questions. Judge Caprio leaned back, watched the boy for a second, and said, "What's your name?" "Mateo." "And how old are you, Mateo?" He held up 5 fingers, then climbed carefully into the side chair the bailiff dragged over. His feet didn't reach the floor. He looked so small up there it should have softened the room. Instead, it sharpened it. Because now every adult in that courtroom had to watch what happened through the eyes of a child who did not understand procedure, only consequence. If you appreciate stories where authority slows down long enough to find the truth, stay with me. Because what happened next changed the entire case. Miguel had come in expecting humiliation. You could see it in the way he stood. Shoulders tight, chin lowered, one hand pressed flat against the rail like he needed something solid to keep from folding. He worked nights for a restoration company out of Cranston, hauling dehumidifiers and demolition tools into flood-damaged basements. 12-hour shifts when storms hit, spotty pay when they didn't. His wife had been gone for 2 years, no dramatic exit. Just an empty closet, a forwarding address in New Bedford, and silence after that. Since then, it had been him and Mateo in a 1-bedroom above Broad Street where rent went up faster than anything else, and every missed day of work meant a decision between groceries and catching up on bills that were already too far behind. So yes, he had kept driving after the first notice, and yes, that mattered. But Caprio had seen too many people lie to him to miss the difference between a performance and a man who has been cornered by math. Miguel wasn't angry. He wasn't slick. He looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that comes from waking up every day already late to a problem you can't afford to solve. The citations were all from the same location. A school zone speed camera on Douglas Avenue. 6 violations over 11 weeks. Each one clocked his white 2011 Ford Transit van between 34 and 38 miles per hour in a 20 zone during restricted hours. Each image captured the same plate number. Same vehicle class, same automatic timestamp format from a private contractor called Civic Eye Traffic Systems. The city's representative, a woman named Denise Frawley from Municipal Collections, spoke with the polished impatience of someone who had repeated the same argument 1,000 times. "He was properly noticed," she said. "He did not respond. He defaulted. He continued operating the vehicle. The city cannot function if every defendant waits until suspension to explain why the law should not apply to them." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Caprio turned to Miguel and asked the question he always asked before deciding whether somebody was irresponsible or trapped. "Why didn't you answer the first ticket?" Miguel hesitated. Then he said, "Because I never saw the first one." The city representative didn't even look up. That is claimed in nearly every suspension hearing. Miguel nodded once, as if he had expected that. I know how it sounds. Then the boy on the bench tugged on the sleeve of his jacket and blurted out, "That truck wasn't even with us." Now the room moved. Caprio looked at him. "What do you mean?" Mateo answered the way children do when they're telling the truth and don't realize adults have complicated it. "It was sleeping at Mr. Leon's shop. Daddy had the loud green truck that week. The white one was broken." Miguel closed his eyes, not because the boy had hurt him, because he had accidentally done the opposite. That one sentence cracked the case open. Caprio asked Miguel if the van had been out of service. Miguel said yes. Transmission failure in late April. Borrowed company vehicle for several days. Thought that didn't matter because nobody was going to believe him anyway. He reached into his pocket, unfolded a grease-stained receipt and handed it up. Leon's auto and transmission, April 22nd. Ford Transit towed in. Gearbox assembly removed. Awaiting parts. The first 3 camera citations were dated April 23rd, April 26th, and April 29. The city representative said it proved nothing. The vehicle could have been released temporarily. The plate could have been transferred. The repair date didn't invalidate the images. Procedure remained procedure. But the judge was no longer looking at her. He was looking at the timestamps. All 6 violations had been issued between 7:43 a.m. and 7:51 a.m., all at nearly identical speeds, all from the same lane angle. Even stranger, the photographic crops were slightly inconsistent. On 2 notices, the left edge of the frame cut off part of the plate border. On 4 others, the background tree line was greener than it should have been for that week's weather, almost like the image layers had been processed in batches rather than captured in real time. That was when the story stopped being about one struggling father. Caprio asked the clerk to hold the matter. He asked the officer in court to pull the citation images on the larger monitor. He asked Miguel where he worked. Restoration company, fleet vehicles, GPS tracked. He asked whether the borrowed green truck had been assigned to him during those dates. Miguel said yes. He named the supervisor, named the depot, named the job on Smith Street where they had been pumping out a flooded basement on the morning of April 26th because a sprinkler main had burst on the 3rd floor. The details came too fast to feel rehearsed. That mattered. Then Caprio asked the city representative something she clearly was not expecting. "How many school zone tickets has this camera issued since installation?" She gave a number from the file, roughly 14,000. "And how much of that is handled by Civic Eye?" A pause. "Revenue Administration is contracted." That answer landed badly. Because in Rhode Island, and in every city where automated enforcement gets sold as efficiency, the clean public language is always the same: safety, compliance, reduced burden on police. But underneath that language, there is often a private company with a payment formula, a municipality addicted to predictable revenue, and a defendant who cannot afford the time it takes to prove a machine wrong. If cases like this make you think, let me know in the comments, because the most dangerous part of a bad system is how ordinary it looks until somebody finally stops the conveyor belt. Caprio ordered a brief recess and had the clerk call the fleet supervisor. 20 minutes later, the man emailed over GPS logs from the restoration company's telematics system, Green Freightliner Unit 18 assigned to Miguel Alvarez. Movement recorded from 6:58 a.m. to 9:12 a.m. on April 26th, including a stop on Smith Street exactly when the white van was supposedly speeding past Douglas Avenue. Then investigators from the court liaison office found something even more damaging. Civic Eye had sent an internal maintenance bulletin 3 weeks earlier, warning municipal clients that a software update could duplicate plate reads across vehicle profiles when images were manually corrected by reviewers under high-volume conditions. In plain English, if the camera thought it saw a plate and a human reviewer approved it too quickly, the wrong plate could attach to the wrong vehicle. The city had the bulletin. The collections office kept enforcing anyway. Now the whole case changed, because once Caprio had reason to question one ticket, the other 5 came under the same cloud. Then came the really ugly number. Of the 6 citations against Miguel, 4 had late fees larger than the original penalty. Once the registration was flagged, reinstatement penalties piled on top. Once the license risk appeared, insurance costs jumped. The city was not just chasing a violator anymore. It had built a pressure machine around a data stream that might be corrupted. Miguel stood there listening as the judge read back the sequence, a defective or at least unreliable camera process. Notices mailed to an old apartment number because one digit on the address had been transposed in the contractor file. Escalating fees on unchallenged citations. Suspension triggered. Tow exposure triggered. Employment at risk. Housing at risk. Child care at risk, all because a machine said a van was somewhere it was not. Then came the line nobody in that room forgot. Judge Caprio looked at the city representative and said, "The law does not become more respectable simply because it is automated." You could feel the balance of power shift. He dismissed all 6 citations on the spot. He vacated the suspension. He waived the collection fees. Then he went further. He ordered the clerk to refer Civic Eye's records at that camera location for immediate review and requested the city solicitor examine whether similarly processed citations from that period had been improperly enforced. What had entered the room as one man's unpaid balance was leaving as a contractor problem, a municipal oversight problem, and possibly a due process problem. Miguel put both hands over his face and bent forward so fast it looked like he had been hit. Mateo didn't understand the legal language, but he understood his father's body. He slid off the chair, ran to him, and wrapped his arms around his leg. Caprio let the silence sit. That was the right call. Not every courtroom moment needs more words. Some of them need room to land. Still, before he closed the file, he looked at Miguel and gave him the part that mattered most. "Mr. Alvarez, you were wrong to keep driving once you knew there was a problem. But this court is also not going to pretend the system did its part here. It didn't. And your son should never have had to be the one to slow this room down enough for us to notice." By the following month, 217 citations from the same camera window were under review. Several were thrown out. The contractor's image verification procedures were suspended. City Hall called it a technical discrepancy. People who had paid years earlier used another word, trap. But the reason this case stayed with Caprio had nothing to do with software or municipal contracts. It was that image. A 5-year-old boy sitting at the edge of the bench, legs swinging, trying with all the seriousness in the world to help an adult system understand what had happened to his father. Near the end, Caprio bent down and asked him one more question. "Mateo, what do you think your dad should do now?" The boy answered without hesitation. "Take me to school and fix the truck the right way." There it was. Cleaner than anything the lawyers or city staff had managed to say all morning. Accountability, mercy, forward motion. If you believe no one should lose everything because a machine was treated like a witness, stay with this story, because that is the real lesson. Not that a judge was kind, not that a father got lucky, but that truth sometimes enters a courtroom in the smallest voice there. And when it does, every polished excuse around it starts to sound exactly like what it is. Noise. The city had papers, fees, notices, contractor language. Miguel had a repair receipt, a borrowed truck, and a child who knew where his father had actually been. In the end, that was enough. Not because innocence is always obvious, usually it isn't, but because real justice begins the moment somebody in authority stops processing a person like a file and starts testing the story for weight. On that rainy morning in Providence, a 5-year-old did not decide his father's fate by asking for sympathy. He decided it by telling one inconvenient truth that the system had no place to put. And once that truth was heard, the whole machine had to answer for itself.